Imagine a world on the edge of annihilation, not because a war had started, but because no one could agree on what kind of war it already was. It was 1947. The smoke from the Second World War had barely cleared. Cities across Europe still smoldered. Millions were displaced. And yet, in the silence that followed history's most catastrophic conflict, something darker was already taking shape. Something that didn't have a name yet. A confrontation without trenches. A battle without bullets. A war that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Two superpowers were circling each other like storm fronts on a collision course. One flew the stars and stripes. The other, the hammer and sickle. And between them, the entire free world held its breath. Then one man sat down at his typewriter and gave this shadow conflict the only name that truly fit. He called it the Cold War. What followed would last nearly half a century. It would reshape every corner of the globe. It would bring humanity to the brink of nuclear extinction. Not once, but again and again. The name itself would become the defining phrase of a generation. School children would learn it. Presidents would invoke it. Generals would plan for it. And the man who coined it, most people have never heard his name. That changes today. To understand how a single phrase could define an era, you have to understand the world that made it necessary, and the extraordinary mind that saw it coming. Before almost anyone else did, his name was Herbert Bayard Swope. But before we get to him, we need to go back. Back to the moment the Cold War began to take shape. Long before anyone dared call it that. The year is 1945. The bombs have fallen. Germany has surrendered. Japan has collapsed under the terrible weight of two atomic detonations that altered the course of human history in a matter of seconds. For a brief, shining moment, there is hope. The Allied powers have fought side by side to defeat fascism. Surely, the thinking went that shared sacrifice meant something. Surely the world could now move forward together. It couldn't. The alliance that defeated Hitler was already fracturing before the ink dried on the surrendered documents. At Yalta, at Potsdam, behind closed doors and across polished diplomatic tables, the cracks were already showing. Franklin Roosevelt was gone, dead just months before victory in Europe. Harry Truman, a former Missouri haberdasher who had been vice president for barely 3 months, now had to face a reality no one had fully prepared him for. America's wartime partner was quickly becoming its most dangerous adversary. Joseph Stalin was not interested in partnership. He was interested in power, and in the ruins of post-war Europe. Power was available in terrifying abundance. Soviet troops that had swept westward to crush the Nazi war machine didn't go home. They stayed. Country by country, the iron hand of Moscow extended across Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, swallowed whole. These were not liberated nations. They were captive ones. And while American soldiers returned home to ticker-tape parades and a booming economy, the Soviets were consolidating an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast of Asia to the very heart of Europe. Winston Churchill saw it clearly, standing at a podium in Fulton, Missouri. In March of 1946, the former British Prime Minister delivered one of the most consequential speeches of the 20th century. He spoke of an iron curtain that had descended across the continent, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. The audience was stunned. The American press was divided. President Truman, who had introduced Churchill that day, quietly distanced himself from the speech, while privately agreeing with almost every word of it. And the problem remained. Stark. Terrifying. How do you describe a conflict that is not yet a war, but is far too dangerous to call peace? Conventional language had failed. Diplomats talk about tensions. Newspapers wrote about rivalry. Generals spoke carefully of strategic competition. But none of it captured the true weight of what was happening. None of it conveyed the existential stakes. The fact that at any moment, a miscalculation, a misread signal, a nervous finger on a trigger somewhere in Berlin or Seoul or the skies of the Pacific could cascade into something that ended civilization itself. The Soviet Union had not yet detonated its first atomic bomb. That would come in 1949. shocking American intelligence officials who had estimated Moscow was years away from nuclear capability. But the theoretical possibility was already there, already haunting every late-night meeting in Washington, every classified briefing in the Pentagon's newly completed corridors, every cable transmitted in cipher between American embassies and the State Department. What do you call a war fought with spies instead of soldiers? With propaganda instead of artillery? With the constant, suffocating threat of annihilation held just out of reach, close enough to feel, never close enough to touch. In 1947, that question didn't yet have a satisfying answer, but it was about to get one, and the man who would provide it was already at work. Herbert Bayard Swope was not a general. He was not a senator. He was not a diplomat or a spy or a nuclear physicist. He was something rarer and in some ways more powerful than any of those things. He was a journalist, arguably the greatest American journalist of the first half of the 20th century. And he understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent his entire career translating the impossible complexity of world events into language that ordinary people could grasp, that what the world needed most in this terrifying new moment was not more information. What it needed was the right words. If stories like this, the hidden figures behind history's most consequential moments, are the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, consider subscribing to Cold War Discoveries. We publish new stories every week, and we're just getting started. Herbert Bayard Swope was, by almost any measure, the most decorated and feared journalist in America, and he knew it. Born in St. Louis in 1882, Swope had clawed his way up from the bottom rungs of American newspapers at a time when journalism was a rough, unforgiving trade, populated by hard drinkers, sharper elbows, and men who understood that the difference between a good story and a great one was often just a matter of nerve. He had nerve in extraordinary abundance. He also had something rarer, an almost preternatural ability to see the shape of history while it was still being made, before the dust settled, before the official version hardened into accepted fact, before the powerful had time to manage the narrative. By the time the Cold War began to take its shadowy form, Swope was already a legend. He had won the very first Pulitzer Prize ever awarded for journalism, back in 1917, for his reporting on Imperial Germany, a series of dispatches so penetrating, so precise in their portrait of a society mobilizing for war, that they're still studied today. He had covered the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War, standing in the corridors of Versailles, while the map of the world was redrawn by exhausted men with trembling hands. He had interviewed the powerful, the dangerous, and the desperate. He had sat across from kings and criminals, and found them, more often than not, equally human and equally flawed. He served as executive editor of the New York World, one of the most influential newspapers in the country. Under his editorial hand, the World launched exposés that toppled corrupt officials, broke open the inner workings of organized crime, and gave ordinary Americans a window into the machinery of power that had previously been sealed shut. But it was not his reporting that would earn Swope his most enduring place in history. It was a speech he wrote for someone else. The man who delivered that speech was Bernard Baruch, financier, statesman, advisor to presidents, and one of the most influential private citizens in American life. Baruch was the kind of figure who existed at the highest altitude of American power, without ever holding elected office. He had advised Woodrow Wilson during the First World War, served as the American representative to the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, and maintained relationships with every significant political figure in Washington across 5 decades. When Bernard Baruch spoke, people listened, not because he held a title, but because he had consistently, almost unervingly, been right. Baruch and Swope had been close friends for years. They were, in many ways, complementary figures. Baruch, the man of money and influence and carefully cultivated gravitas. Swope, the man of language and instinct and spectacular personal magnetism. They talked constantly, argued freely, and sharpened each other's thinking in a way that only genuine intellectual equals can. In the spring of 1947, Baruch was preparing remarks for a formal occasion in South Carolina. a ceremony marking the unveiling of his portrait at the state legislature in Columbia. On the surface, a ceremonial event, a moment of civic honor, not the obvious setting for a phrase that would define the next 50 years of human history. But Baruch and Swope were not men who wasted occasions. Swope had been turning a phrase over in his mind for some time. He had tried it in private correspondence, tested it in conversation, weighed it against alternatives, and found them all wanting. The phrase needed to be precise without being technical, vivid without being inflammatory. It needed to capture something that was simultaneously a military reality, a political condition, a psychological state, and a moral crisis, all in 2 words. Cold War. The logic of it, once you heard it, was almost self-evident. It was not a hot war, not the burning, explosive, immediately lethal catastrophe of the conflicts that had consumed the first half of the century. But it was not peace either. It was something colder, something that operated below the threshold of open violence, while maintaining all of the danger, all of the fear, all of the potential for sudden catastrophic escalation that war implied. A war of nerves, of shadows, of ideology and intelligence and atomic arsenals held in perpetual readiness. Cold War. Swope gave the phrase to Baruch. And Baruch, standing before the South Carolina legislature on April 16, 1947, delivered it to the world. The United States, Baruch declared, was in the midst of a Cold War, not a temporary disagreement, not a diplomatic friction. A war, cold in its methods, but total in its implications. The reaction was not immediate. The speech in Columbia generated respectable coverage, but it did not explode across the national consciousness overnight. A phrase, no matter how perfectly calibrated, needs time. It needs repetition. It needs to be picked up by the right voices, deployed in the right moments, woven into enough sentences by enough influential people, that it begins to feel not like a coinage, but like a discovery, like a word that was always waiting to be found. That catalyst came later the same year, in the hands of Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was, if anything, even more influential in the world of American political thought than Swope himself. A columnist, an author, an intellectual of the first rank, Lippmann had been shaping American foreign policy opinion since the Wilson administration. His column, Today and Tomorrow, was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers across the country. When Lippmann took a position on something, it mattered in Washington in ways that most politicians could only dream of. In 1947, Lippmann was deeply troubled by the direction of American foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine, the sweeping commitment to contain Soviet expansion wherever it appeared, struck him as dangerously vague, potentially unlimited in its implications. In response, he wrote a series of columns that were subsequently collected and published as a short book. He called it, quite simply, The Cold War. It was Lippmann's book that embedded the phrase permanently into the American political vocabulary. It was discussed in Congress, debated in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles, translated and read in capitals across Europe and Asia. By the time Lippmann was finished, the Cold War was no longer just a phrase. It was a defining framework through which the entire Western world would understand the conflict between American democracy and Soviet communism for the next 4 decades. The name had found its moment, and in finding its moment, it shaped the moment in return, because names are never neutral. This is the part of the story that historians sometimes understate, and it is worth pausing on. The decision to call this conflict a war, even a cold one, carried enormous consequences. It committed the American government, the American military, and the American people to a posture of permanent vigilance. Wars are not situations you manage passively. Wars require resources, sacrifice, strategy, and sustained will. Wars demand that you take seriously the possibility that the other side is trying to destroy you, because they are. By naming the Soviet-American confrontation a war, Swope and Baruch and Lippmann were making an argument. They were insisting against the optimists and the appeasers and the exhausted pragmatists who just wanted the world to calm down, that what was happening was serious, deadly serious, and that the United States needed to respond to it with the full weight of its national power. That argument turned out to be correct. Consider what was actually unfolding in the years immediately after the phrase entered common usage. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine committed American support to Greece and Turkey, nations threatened by Soviet-backed communist insurgencies. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall at Harvard in June of that same year, committed billions of American dollars to the reconstruction of Western Europe, explicitly to prevent economic desperation from driving exhausted populations into the arms of Soviet-aligned communist parties. The National Security Act of 1947 reorganized the entire American military and intelligence establishment, creating the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, and, crucially, the Central Intelligence Agency. All of this was happening simultaneously, all of it animated by the same recognition that the Cold War phrase had crystallized, that the United States was in a long-term, high-stakes, existential competition with the Soviet Union, and that winning it would require a level of sustained commitment, institutional capacity, and strategic sophistication that peacetime America had never previously maintained. The naming of the Cold War was not merely a linguistic event. It was a mobilization. And here is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, because Swope himself understood exactly what he had done. He was not a naive man. He did not coin phrases accidentally or deploy them carelessly. He knew, with the precision of a craftsman who has spent his entire life working in language, that the words we choose to describe our reality shape the reality itself. In private correspondence from this period, Swope wrote about the need for clarity, for honest, unflinching language that refused to euphemize the Soviet threat or pretend that the world was safer than it actually was. He believed, with genuine conviction, that the American public deserved to understand what their country was facing, not in the sanitized, bureaucratic language of government reports, but in direct, human, emotionally honest terms that made the stakes unmistakable. Cold War did all of that. It told you it was a war. It told you it was different from other wars. It told you to be alert, but not to panic. It told you the conflict was real and ongoing, but that it had not yet crossed into the catastrophic. It held the tension precisely, in the way that only the best writing does, between alarm and steadiness. It was, in short, exactly the kind of phrase that could sustain a nation through decades of anxiety and sacrifice, without either terrifying it into paralysis or lulling it into complacency. A phrase engineered, whether consciously or not, for endurance. And endure, it did. But understanding the power of a phrase is one thing. Living inside it is something else entirely. By 1949, the Cold War had stopped being an abstraction. It had stopped being a columnist's framework, a statesman's rhetorical device, a journalist's elegant coinage. It had become the operative reality of American life, felt in kitchens and classrooms, in factory floors and foreign ministries, in the quiet dread that settled over Washington every time a cable arrived from a distant embassy, with news that no one wanted to read. The world was changing faster than anyone had anticipated, and not in directions that offered comfort. On August 29, 1949, a Soviet bomber flew over a remote test site in Kazakhstan and dropped the device. The fireball rose, the shockwave spread, and in that single terrible moment, the American monopoly on nuclear weapons vanished. The Soviets had the bomb. American intelligence had estimated it would take them until at least 1953. Some analysts had argued even longer. The actual timeline, less than 4 years after Hiroshima, represented a catastrophic intelligence failure, one that sent tremors through the entire American national security establishment. How had they done it so quickly? The answer, when it eventually emerged, was a combination of brilliant Soviet scientists, ruthless state mobilization of resources, and espionage. The secret to the Manhattan Project had been stolen. Klaus Fuchs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a network of agents who had penetrated the most classified program in American history and fed its most sensitive details directly to Moscow. The Cold War had just become infinitely more dangerous. The logic of nuclear deterrence, the idea that mutual destruction made direct conflict unthinkable, only worked if both sides believed the other was rational, restrained, unlikely to miscalculate. And in the autumn of 1949, with a Soviet nuclear test still echoing across the intelligence community's worst nightmares, rational restraint was not something anyone in Washington was prepared to take for granted. President Truman authorized the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon so many times more destructive than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan that the comparison almost defied comprehension. The arms race that would define the next 4 decades had begun in earnest, and then China fell on October 1st, 1949, barely 5 weeks after the Soviet nuclear test. Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government, which the United States had supported through years of brutal civil war, had collapsed, retreated to the island of Taiwan, the most populous nation on earth, had gone communist. In Washington, the question that echoed through every corridor of power was simple and devastating. Who lost China? It was, in many ways, the wrong question. China had not been America's to lose. The nationalist government had been corrupt, militarily incompetent, and deeply unpopular with its own people. No amount of American aid could have substituted for the political legitimacy that Mao's forces had built through years of fighting and promising land reform to hundreds of millions of desperate peasants. But the right question and the politically useful question are rarely the same thing. And in the charged atmosphere of late 1949, with the Soviet bomb still fresh in the national psyche, the fall of China felt like catastrophe. The Cold War geography had expanded overnight. What had begun as a European confrontation, a struggle over the fate of Germany, over the countries behind the Iron Curtain, was now global. It stretched from the North Atlantic to the Pacific. It encompassed not just the old industrial powers of Europe, but the vast, restless, newly decolonizing nations of Asia and Africa and Latin America, all of them now potential battlegrounds in a conflict between two systems of organizing human society. Herbert Bayard Swope's 2-word phrase had to stretch further than even he had imagined, and it held. Korea proved it. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea in overwhelming force, armed with Soviet weapons, trained by Soviet advisors, and almost certainly operating with Soviet foreknowledge. The invasion was swift, brutal, and initially devastating. South Korean forces and the small American garrison that happened to be in their path were pushed back almost to the sea before a desperate defensive perimeter was established around the port city of Pusan. Truman's response was immediate. He committed American forces under the authority of a United Nations resolution. The Soviets had been boycotting the Security Council at the time and were thus unable to exercise their veto, and appointed General Douglas MacArthur to command combined forces. Within weeks, American boys who had been living ordinary civilian lives were being rushed to the other side of the world to fight in a country most of them had never heard of, for stakes that had to be explained in terms of the larger Cold War framework that Swope's phrase had made possible. This was not, Truman insisted, a war. It was a police action, a limited conflict under international authority. The Cold War framework demanded this kind of careful labeling, because to declare war would have been to risk escalation into the very hot conflict that everyone was desperately trying to avoid. The nuclear dimension hung over every decision, every tactical choice, every diplomatic cable, every statement made by every official in Washington or Tokyo or Seoul, filtered to the terrifying awareness that somewhere in Moscow, someone was watching, calculating, and that the wrong move could transform a limited conflict into something that ended the world. MacArthur's audacious amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 turned the tide with stunning speed. The North Korean army was cut off, encircled, shattered. American and United Nations forces swept north, crossing the 38th parallel and driving toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. For a moment, it seemed possible that the entire peninsula could be unified under a pro-Western government, and then China entered the war. In November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu in the darkness, descending on overextended American and United Nations forces in conditions of brutal winter cold. The Marines at the Chosin Reservoir fought one of the most extraordinary fighting retreats in American military history. 17 days, minus 30-degree temperatures, surrounded, outnumbered, fighting their way to the coast through human wave assaults that came in the night, with bugles and whistles and ferocity that stunned even hardened veterans of the Second World War. They made it out, most of them, and in making it out, they demonstrated something important about the American military character, a capacity for endurance under conditions that would have broken lesser forces, something that would be tested again and again in the decades to come. But the strategic situation had been transformed. The dream of Korean reunification, gone. The war settled into a grinding, bloody stalemate along lines roughly approximating where it had started. And there would remain for another 2.5 years, costing more than 36,000 American lives, before an armistice was finally signed in July of 1953. The Cold War had produced its first hot conflict, and the lesson absorbed in every capital on Earth was sobering in the extreme. The line between cold and hot was thin, movable, and terrifyingly easy to cross. This was the world that Swope's phrase now inhabited. And the phrase itself had become something more than a description. It had become a doctrine, a shorthand, a conceptual architecture through which every event on Earth was now interpreted. A coup in Iran, Cold War. A revolution in Guatemala, Cold War. A crisis in the Formosa Strait, Cold War. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the slow American slide into involvement in Vietnam, Cold War. Every earthquake in the international order was now measured on the Richter scale of superpower competition, and the instrument for that measurement was a framework that two words had established. This was both the genius and the danger of the phrase. The genius was clarity. The Cold War framework gave American policymakers, military planners, and ordinary citizens a coherent way to understand a chaotic world. It told you who the enemy was, what was at stake, and why distant events in obscure places mattered to the security of the United States. It provided the narrative spine for a foreign policy that had to operate simultaneously on every continent, in every domain, across every conceivable dimension of national power. The danger was simplification, because the world is not, in fact, a binary place. Not every revolution was Moscow directed. Not every nationalist movement was a Soviet proxy. Not every country that refused American alignment was an enemy. The Cold War framework, applied too rigidly, too reflexively, could produce catastrophic misreadings. And it did, repeatedly. Vietnam was the most devastating example, but it was far from the only one. Swope lived long enough to see some of the consequences of the world his phrase had helped to frame. He died in 1958, just as the Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous phases, the period that would culminate, for years later, in 13 days in October, that brought human civilization closer to extinction than it had ever been before, or has been since. He did not live to see the Cuban Missile Crisis. He did not live to see the moon landing, or Vietnam, or détente, or the fall of the Berlin Wall. He did not live to see the moment, in December of 1991, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist and the conflict he had named finally, quietly ended. But he had seen enough. He had watched his two words grow from a private correspondence into a speech, from a speech into a book, from a book into a doctrine, from a doctrine into the organizing principle of an entire civilization's relationship with the future. Two words, one man, and a world that would never look the same again. There's a question that historians rarely ask, because it sounds almost too philosophical for a discipline devoted to facts and evidence and the careful reconstruction of what actually happened. The question is this: what if it had been called something else? What if the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union had been named the Long Peace, or the Armed Truce, or the Ideological Struggle, or any of the dozens of other phrases that were floated in those first uncertain post-war years, before Swope's coinage swept them all aside? It is not an idle question, because language does not merely describe reality. It constitutes it. The words we choose to frame a situation determine, in ways both obvious and invisible, how we think about it, how we respond to it, what we are willing to sacrifice for it, and how long we are prepared to sustain the effort it demands. The long peace would have implied that the danger was manageable, that the right posture was patience, accommodation, a gradual wearing down of tensions through dialogue and trade, and the slow work of diplomacy. It would have suggested that the proper American response was essentially passive. Wait it out, don't provoke. Trust that time and prosperity would eventually dissolve the threat. The armed truce would have implied something even more dangerous, that the conflict was essentially over, that the fighting had stopped, and what remained was merely the administrative business of formalizing the cessation of hostilities. It would have encouraged a kind of institutional relaxation, the demobilization of will and capacity, that had left America dangerously unprepared for the conflicts of the early 20th century. Cold War implied none of those things. Cold War said, this is not peace. This is not a truce. This is a war conducted by other means, and it requires of you everything that war has always required: vigilance, sacrifice, strategic intelligence, technological superiority, and the unbroken resolve to defend what you believe in against an adversary who is entirely serious about destroying it. That framing saved lives, perhaps millions of them. Consider what American resolve, sustained by that framework, actually produced across 4.5 decades of Cold War competition. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe, not out of charity alone, but out of the strategic understanding that desperate, hungry, economically shattered people were vulnerable to the appeal of communist ideology, and that the best answer to Soviet propaganda was a Europe prosperous enough to reject it. $16 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1948 terms, flowing from American coffers into the reconstruction of nations that had been enemies as recently as 3 years earlier. It was one of the most strategically brilliant acts of enlightened self-interest in the history of great power competition. And it worked. Western Europe recovered. Its democracies held. The communist parties of France and Italy, which had seemed on the verge of electoral dominance in the late 1940s, gradually lost their grip on the imaginations of populations that were, year by year, becoming more prosperous, more invested in the system that prosperity represented. NATO followed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the first peacetime military alliance in American history, a direct repudiation of the isolationist traditions that had kept America on the sidelines of European affairs for so long. It bound the United States irrevocably to the defense of Western Europe. An attack on any member, the treaty declared, would be considered an attack on all, a commitment of breathtaking scope, backed by the full weight of American military power, and the implicit and later explicit guarantee of American nuclear deterrence. Stalin tested it. His successors tested it. None of them crossed it. The space race produced the most audacious technological achievement in human history, a moment when American ingenuity and American will and American investment in science and engineering combined to do something that no civilization had ever done before. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. He planted an American flag in the lunar soil and spoke words that were heard by the largest simultaneous audience in the history of human communication. That achievement did not happen because Americans suddenly developed an abstract love of astrophysics. It happened because the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957 and demonstrated, in a single terrifying beep transmitted from low Earth orbit, that they possess a rocket technology to deliver a nuclear warhead to any city in the United States. The Cold War had militarized the heavens, and the moon landing was, among other things, the most spectacular possible demonstration that American technology, American creativity, American institutional capacity was more than equal to anything the Soviet system could produce. The integrated circuit, the Internet, born as ARPANET, a Defense Department project designed to maintain communication networks in the event of nuclear attack. GPS, the jet age, satellite communications. Dozens of the technologies that define modern life trace their origins, directly or indirectly, to Cold War competition and the massive, sustained investment in science and engineering that competition demanded. The Cold War made the modern world, and the name that made the Cold War legible, that gave it shape and urgency and moral clarity, was 2 words, coined by a large, brilliant, largely forgotten journalist from St. Louis, who sat down one day and decided that the world needed better language. Herbert Bayard Swope never received a monument for this contribution. There is no Cold War memorial in Washington that bears his name. No major biography has been written about him in decades. He exists at the margins of the histories he helped to shape, mentioned in footnotes, credited in passing, acknowledged without being truly seen. This is, in its way, the fate of all great phrase makers. The words outlive the word maker. The frame becomes invisible precisely because it has become universal, so thoroughly embedded in the way we think about the world that we can no longer imagine thinking about it any other way. We cannot feel the shape of the container because we have been living inside it for so long. But the invisibility is itself a measure of the achievement. The greatest act of communication are the ones that disappear into common understanding, that stop being felt as language at all, and start being felt as reality. Swope's Cold War reached that level of penetration faster and held it longer than almost any political phrase in modern history. Think about what it survived. It survived the death of Stalin and the chaotic succession struggles that followed. It survived Korea and the bitter stalemate that ended it. It survived McCarthy and the convulsions of domestic anti-communism that threatened to make the Cold War something uglier and more paranoid than the sober strategic competition Swope had named. It survived Sputnik, the moon landing, Vietnam, Watergate, Détente, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It survived the rise of solidarity in Poland, the election of Ronald Reagan, the deployment of Pershing missiles in Europe, and the moment in 1983 when a Soviet early warning system mistakenly detected an American nuclear launch. And a single Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov decided, on his own authority and against protocol, not to report up the chain of command, a decision that may have prevented a nuclear exchange that the world would not learn about for decades. Through all of it, the phrase held. Cold War, 2 words, 46 years. When the Berlin Wall fell, on the night of November 9th, 1989, the images that went around the world were of ordinary people. East Germans, mostly, but also West Germans, journalists, curious bystanders from a dozen countries, taking hammers and pickaxes to a concrete barrier that had stood for 28 years as the most visible symbol of everything the Cold War represented. They were laughing and crying and embracing strangers and chipping away at the wall with whatever came at hand, prying out chunks of painted concrete as souvenirs of a world that was, in that moment, unmistakably ending. 2 years later, on December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on Soviet state television and announced his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. The 15 republics that had constituted the USSR went their separate ways. The state that had been America's adversary for nearly half a century. The state whose nuclear arsenal had made the Cold War terrifying, whose ideology had made it existential, simply ceased to exist. The Cold War was over, and in the silence that followed, in the extraordinary, disorienting quiet of a world that had been organized around a single overwhelming conflict for so long that it had forgotten how to think without it, people reached, naturally and almost unconsciously, the phrase that had named what was ending. The Cold War is over. They said, the Cold War has ended. We won the Cold War. Even in its conclusion, the phrase did its work. It gave the ending the same clarity it had given the beginning. It told you what had happened, what had been at stake, and what the outcome meant. It was, to the very last, exactly the right language for exactly the right moment. Herbert Bayard Swope could not have known, sitting at his typewriter somewhere in the mid-1940s, turning a phrase over his mind and testing it against the alternatives, that he was coining something that would last as long as the conflict it described. He could not have known that the 2 words he was assembling would be spoken by presidents and premiers, written into treaties and doctrines, taught to children on every continent, used to explain the shape of the modern world to generations who had never known any other shape. He knew he was trying to name something important. He knew the name mattered. That much, at least, was always clear to him, that the right language at the right moment was itself a form of power, not the power of armies, or economies, or nuclear arsenals. Something subtler, and in its own way, more durable. The power to make people see. To look at a complicated, frightening, genuinely unprecedented situation, and suddenly understand it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, in the way that good writing always communicates, through the gut as much as the mind, to feel the stakes, to grasp what was at hand, to know, without quite being able to explain why, that this was serious, and that it required of you something serious in return. That is what Cold War did. That is what Herbert Bayard Swope did. In 2 words, in one of the most consequential acts of language in the 20th century, he made people see, and in seeing, they were better prepared to act, to sustain, through decades of anxiety and sacrifice and occasional terror, an unexpected triumph. The long, difficult, and ultimately successful defense of a way of life that was worth defending. The Cold War ended. The free world endured. And somewhere in the foundation of that endurance, holding up more than most people will ever know, are 2 words from a journalist that history almost forgot. Cold War. Remember the name. And remember the man who gave it to us. If this story moved you, if you believe that the hidden figures behind history's defining moments deserve to be remembered, then hit the like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe to Cold War Discoveries. These stories deserve to be told, and we're just getting started.